Sorry, we're in the dark a little bit. Yes, this opening picture actually is during what was referred to as Games Time. Anybody familiar with the London 2012 Speak, or the kind of spoof TV programme? I'm coming along here probably at the tail end of a series of professorial lectures from art and designers. Like I said, a lot of new appointments, and I'm one of those. So it was challenging, I suppose, probably my time of life, to realise that most of my work is in the past. Unless I decide to work, and the government actuary probably would like me to work until I'm 90 if I last that long. So one isn't normally accustomed to looking back. It's certainly, I've just always been busy running, like I said, normally research centres, research institutes, with several research projects going on at the same time, research students and so on. And therefore taking stock and looking back and trying to make some sense, logic about one's past, isn't something really you have the time to do or the inclination. But in a way this is perhaps an opportunity, forced me to think about, is there any method in my madness? Has there been a trajectory, has there been a common theme or themes which inform my work? Because I think most of us, as we grow older, people think that you've got this huge amount of knowledge, but most of the things and attitudes you had 25, 30 years ago are largely unchanging. The core principles that you've grown up with and developed as a sort of social human being form that work. So in a way, this is a kind of retrospective, and I've never had to thought about this before, but to with the benefit of hindsight, if you like, trying to track some of the research themes, link that to the variety of projects. Like most of my predecessors giving these lectures, we're a fairly eclectic and probably an eccentric bunch. And that's kind of what you expect from professors, I think. And I'm probably no exception to that. I'm not going to give the kind of physical performance that Paul Hayward did. I'm sure I won't be as erudite as most of the other professors, who probably write a lot more books than I do. But my starting point was, the last time I had to stand up and do a kind of public lecture linked to a kind of new professorial appointment was back in Brunel. Like I said, I was kind of chair design in a design and engineering department. One of my themes of my probably over-ambitious title is the cultures of design, and that was a very interesting one, working with a dominant engineering culture, engineering designers. They they think they're doing design as engineers. They're not really, not probably not what we would recognise as creative designers. So quite a different kind of design culture, and that most of my career, I guess, has been working with other disciplines, professions, in a formal sense, and obviously working with communities and end users and clients and customers, whatever you want to call that. So for a long time, I've always worked a little bit, not fish out of water, but working with those other cultures, and that's something which makes it easy for me to collaborate, because I have a fairly sort of even acceptance and adaptability to other people's systems, languages, codes, and those kind of cultures. But it is something I'm become more interested in, because it does produce in practice, both academically and in the so-called real world, a fragmentation, if you like, in terms of the silos that are built up around both professional practice, around public policy, around a lot of the research lines. And academic silos are probably part of that in terms of the disciplines and subjects within that, and we could just focus on one school of art and design, and we would see that there's a design culture and there's a kind of fine art culture which is quite different. So I think we inhabit this interesting world that is together but separate. So I kind of look back at this, and this is the last one I gave, and hopefully they gave us a theme, so I didn't have to come up with something completely original. It's this notion of the urban psychosis, so I did a presentation. But I wasn't alone. The panel, a couple of us, and the opportunity, A, to name drop Will Self, and B, have gratuitous nudity is an opportunity I couldn't really miss. So I had this extensive PowerPoint presentation, far too many slides, and it's going to happen again here. Will came afterwards. Of course, he has one slide. Being an erstwhile infamous kind of author and journalist, he read from a pre-prepared script, word for word, whereas I can never, ever do that. I can barely look at notes now once I get going. But it also, I got to know Will a little bit, and he'd become a professor, I think, of contemporary thought, fairly pretentious title, I think, but kind of creative writing in parenthesis. He used to take film studies students on psychogeographic tours. You've heard the term psychogeography, which he and others, people like Ian Sinclair, have kind of adopted, really going to places, the interstitial zones of cities. He used to take film studies students from Uxbridge, where Bruno was based, out to Heathrow. And the idea of actually walking to Heathrow Airport is quite an interesting, interesting challenge. And I think psychogeography has that kind of trespass element to it. But at the same time, he fell in my sort of my experience to that side which is more common in academia of the culture of pessimism, that their outlook on the world not just negative per se, sceptical yes, cynical perhaps, but a culture of pessimism which is something I've probably been part of as well. If you probably read any of my work, you find work that is maybe highly critical, but evidence based and underpinned by research rather than say opinionated. Whereas the rest of whereas design, for instance, I would say has a culture of optimism. I mean, most designers start with that aspirations that they want to change, they want to contribute through their design, whether it be product, industrial design, architecture, something positive. Don't start out with that kind of pessimistic standpoint. So there's a kind of dialectic. There's a kind of tension there, I think, both within academia and between academic research, politicians perhaps, they're over optimistic. And one of the responses to that is that we are the counterbalance to the over-optimism and the hype. Look at our first slide of the London Olympics, where it has to be a fairly boosterist project in order to get that public democratic support and to spend a huge amount of taxpayers' money on a major capital project. Whereas you read most of the literature, academic literature, on things like mega events and Olympic cities, for instance, they would tend to be fairly negative, the culture of pessimism, if you like, is the new format. So two interesting cultures. But I think here we are, maybe the general optimist, me, and yourself, and pessimist. I think it seems to be the form that one has some personal history, and it's not completely arbitrary, but again, opportunistic. My claim to fame that I think I mentioned in my interview was playing with the bandos in there at the Hornsey College of Art, School of Art and Design. I think it has different names at the time, which was actually probably about a 10-minute walk from where we currently live, as it happens. So I was kind of familiar with the art school. It was a gig we played in 1970, a couple of years before the big 1968 kind of sit-in. Indicative perhaps in those days, I think it was one of our highest paying gigs. So indication of how flush student unions were. Not only that, there were two bands playing simultaneously. So Supertramp were on one floor and we were on another. And we had a bigger audience because they weren't that well known then. And of course we were much more hip. So my first contact with Middlesex University as was. After that gig, the drummer, which is Richard, this is me, don't recognise me, moustache, collected the cash. We were drinking the Railway Tavern, which is just around the corner. Those that you remember the Hornsey School of Art up on Crouch Hill. We met this Glaswegian, and we had tickets to the Bath Blues Festival. It was on that weekend. He offered us a lift. We were gonna sort of hitch and get trained the next morning, and we did. It turned out to be a stolen car. We didn't know that. He'd stolen the keys off the bar guy, and we turned up in the middle of the night about 1 o'clock. It'd be raining quite a bit. We just slept out in the damp fields. I do remember. I don't remember that much about what we were playing. Me playing flute. I think I was playing guitar for that gig. But I remember Canned Heat were playing as we arrived. So that's embedded in my my memory. So there's a kind of trajectory link, because I obviously now research festivals and events, and I think the return, if you like, the boom of collective experience around major events, of course, is I think a response to social atomization and that need, if you like, for shared experience. Of course, it's come back in a much more commodified version today. But I think the phenomenon of major festivals and events is something which is of particular interest, and I'll probably come back to that. So we last night, Anne Massey had the launch of her book on the ICA, 1948 to 68. All right, just remember that. So wait. But I think on the platform, the issue of archiving, the difficulty of documenting what is relatively near history now, but it's history. Back in the day, one was part of this world, perhaps. But now it's kind of 50 years old, even longer in 1948, looking at 1968 in the 60s. And we talk a lot amongst ourselves, given Middlesex and the Hornsey roots, about the role and roots of the arts school and what that means today. I guess my first experience, and it was a slightly parallel universe that did overlap, was that of arts labs, which were much more informal. I mean, they were based in the back of pubs, community centres, highly informal spaces, and that's something I've always been interested in terms of that flexibility and informality. And there's been interesting formal research over the years, and in fact, if you look at children's activity and participation in the arts, for instance, and how it influences their behaviour and appreciation and, you know, cultural consumption, if you like, as adults, it's their informal exposure and experience more than their formal experience of going on a museum visit, going to see Shakespeare at a mainstream theatre. And that's something that's always stuck with me. And I guess part of my research, and particularly around planning for culture, has focused on that difference, that not just participation, but the kind of type of places where culture is accessed and experienced make a significant difference. And I think it has relevance for all institutions, including the university, in terms of the atmosphere and the environment which we engender, that difference between the formality, the informality, and the freedom. This is a kind of manifesto around that time. This is a quote from the chap who was running the Beckenham Arts Lab, which is where I first probably performed, age 14, 15 onwards. So it's the precursor to the Hornsey gig. And down here, not many people know that David Bowie was the arts administrator. So David was the kind of the guy that put the place on the map, but at that time he was no better known than anybody else, except his mum. He had a perm, and his mum used to press his bell-bottom trousers the wrong way, so we thought he was a bit of a wally, frankly. But he was a nice wally. But it was that flexibility, it was that mix of art forms that anything went. It wasn't a theatre, it wasn't a cinema, it wasn't about dance. It was about that collaboration. So in a way, it was the first experience of collaborating creatively, which these kind of spaces engendered, which more single art form spaces tend not to encourage. And about that time, I suppose this is informing my kind of next move, is that out of the Art Lab movement really came Joan Littlewood's concept of this fun factory that was then picked up by her friend Cedric Price, the late Cedric Price, the architect, who was part of the kind of Archigram group and the non-plan group. You had this kind of model, and this is her idea of the university of the streets. Temporality and flexibility of space was a key part of that. Very much in contrast to concrete stadia and the kind of monoliths that most of the mainstream, if you like, cultural facilities have today. They had tried to get planning permission to actually build his Cedric Price's model in Millsmead, which is now just below where the Olympic site is. So in fact what we ended up with is a concrete stadia that will be stained and cracking, and legacies of noble contemporary architecture. I guess we're familiar with in terms of how things actually went, in terms of whether we went down the more flexible, experimental spaces for culture, or we actually go down the kind of formal, designed and fairly impervious, museums very much with walls as opposed to without walls. So I think that there's an interesting reference I couldn't help putting together there. So in the late 1970s, I joined this organisation, Interaction, that was set up by Ed Berman. He's the very hairy, furry guy there, who was a dropout from Harvard and a dropout from Oxford. Kept beating people up, getting arrested, and was a kind of radical, I suppose. This is the Fun Art bus that basically toured round. So I guess this was a key moment in what was and became a growing community arts movement, where arts was very much the process. We established the first city farm in Kentish Town, and then turned into a national movement. Most cities have a city farm, yes, now this is the very first one that we set up. This is the building, which Cedric Price did design, but if you go to most of the exhibitions, Archigram or others about Cedric Price, they don't actually reference it, they don't use it. So this point about the stories going on in terms of what's valid, what's representative is quite interesting. So the point is that there's a history that's missing. And one of the things I'll do probably before I hang up my mouse is to write the history of art centres, because it's never actually been documented. So that's a kind of future thing. So I spent 7 or 8 years at this organisation, which an example, we had artists like Liz Lay, who's a Canadian born originally. She made these concrete cows, which anybody knows Milton Keynes, the sort of last new town that we built. She built these concrete cows. She was an artist in residence for the Milton Keynes Development Corporation. And it was along the railway line, so if you were coming into Milton Keynes, you could see them. Like a lot of those projects that are quite symbolic, fun, silly, but also relevant as well, because it's just trying to promote Milton Keynes as a sort of city in the countryside. A lot of criticism, a lot of obviously media criticism, and I think this is something that obviously a lot of public art schemes. The Angel of the North was a classic case before that actually went up. There was a massive Daily Mail, Daily Express campaign, and you remember that the Gateshead Council were pilloried, if you like, for spending public money on something so ridiculous as a rusty steel monolith stuck up on the hill over Gateshead. Of course, 5 minutes after it's up there, it becomes adopted by the community and obviously a symbol. So this issue of kind of risk and taking risks and how far you can go against prior public opinion is something I think which art and design has to struggle with, has to strike a balance between. But I think concrete sculpture was a particular device because a lot of the work the organisation did was situated within neighbourhoods where we could work in housing estates, and it's the advantage of concrete, it's very cheap, it's quite quick to put together, and you can paint it once it's dry, so you could make some fantastic shapes and involve young kids and people. It's a very accessible material form. The concrete cows, occasionally they've been beheaded, they've been stolen. Somebody at Halloween snuck in and painted them as skeletons. So in a way they are. This is years. This is 20, 30 years after they were built. So it's interesting that these kind of art interventions have a life of their own, not unlike kind of academic work in a way. But once it's out there, we no longer own it. It's interpreted, taken, translated. The stuff you think is good, people ignore. The stuff you think is off the top of your head, people really rarefy. There is this very strange process of kind of value systems going on. So, as I said at the beginning, I've used the opportunity to try and get a backtrack, and is there a rationale for the kind of stuff I've been doing? Because I've covered quite a lot of ground in 25 plus years. I guess this has been a sort of a spatial and a particular type of space interest. So most things are related, not exclusively around cities and urban cultures, and I guess this constellation around here gives an idea, some work around urban design, events I mentioned, cultural production, and with time, I'm going to speed very quickly through about half a dozen completed projects, and then a couple of new ones going forward, as they say. Cultural planning and policy, work around urban heritage and tourism, and the urban environment probably more lately. So this is how this has manifested itself in terms of different fields of study, subject areas and sites of study. So work I'll touch on around mixed-use design. Regeneration has been a sort of common theme, because really regeneration kicked in the 1970s. The term was first coined, really, revitalisation in the US. So much of my work has tended to be, if not explicitly, around regeneration, whether that's social, community, physical, environmental, or economic. That has been a kind of meta theme behind the change that is being undergoing on particular sites and communities. Interest in the street, I'll touch upon that, street and accessibility. The events field, work around capitals of culture, some novel work around late night festivals I might touch on. Olympics, interest in culture creative clusters and the digital economy. Really underneath that, there's been questions around what is creativity. Obviously a lot of literature when the American Richard Florida coined this notion of the creative class that turned creativity into a much more expansive field. It wasn't just artists, it wasn't people working in the creative sector. The fact is most people who are creative workers, as defined, do not reside within the creative industries. They're outside in other fields, whether it's a designer working for Ford or whether it's a professor of art design that's formerly in education, not in the creative sector. So therefore that relationship between creativity, innovation, and how people work together, again, some of the work around creative clusters I'll touch on if I have enough time, which I probably won't. I've started to talk about the cultural amenity and mapping work, heritage, identity, conflicts. I mean, work not just in the UK, work in Mexico. I've worked quite a bit in Canadian cities, in Toronto, Quebec, as well as Vancouver to a lesser extent, and Montreal. So I guess there's been a comparative city and urban culture strand to my work, which again raises issues of comparability, whether comparative studies, whether things look and sound the same, and this is a big issue, I think, in terms of, when we're talking about global culture, so many things, so many processes seem to be identical, seem to be universal. It's globalization, stupid. But in fact, on the ground, they're not. The stories, the narratives, the experience, the systems underlying what's going on, even though it looks like they're building a new art museum in Dubai, that's just the same as building an art museum. The process is the same, it's Western architects and so on, and there are big issues there. But I think my work has tended to emphasise more and more the difference, the convergence, that even though things look the same in a kind of physical and even design sense, in fact, socially they are quite different, which is this kind of social and production and consumption theme that I've coined, which again, if I ever have time to get a book contract together, probably in my next tome. So this is how some of those topics are manifested, themes and concepts, and this is probably as academic as I'm going to get. Design of the everyday and everyday life. So there's been most design magazines, most architecture magazines are about the grand buildings, aren't they? Because they're the ones where most of the money is, they're the ones that look pretty, they're the ones that get the media profile. But most of our contact and experience of space and experience of design is the everyday, from inside our homes, in the streets we live, in the transport systems, the things we do every day in our kind of social, leisure and work life. So attention to design of the everyday and everyday life doesn't mean that shouldn't also keep your attention to the grand, to the uplifting, to the kind of exceptional events. But I think it also relates to the idea around common culture. People like Paul Willis and what Raymond Williams proposed some years ago, particularly in terms of cultural development, that introducing change incrementally over time is a much more sustainable way to affect change, to introduce new ideas, and certainly art and design, I think, could benefit from that, rather than coming in with a big sort of project and banging people on the head with major change. Choice and selectivity, I think this is something which is very pertinent to our field. The role of the curator, the programmer, the policy maker, the decision maker, the role of the intermediary has grown and grown, a much more powerful group, and most of us are one side of that and sometimes play that role as well. The scale of representation, because a lot of my work has been at the micro level, if you like, and at the city level. Lefebvre had his kind of three levels of the kind of dwelling, the private realm, the kind of neighbourhood city realm, and the kind of global realm. So I think the challenge for research has always been how do you scale things up and scale things down? It's a question that's asked quite a lot by research funders, because they want ideas and solutions that are transferable. Well, that's a good approach. The not production, consumption of knowledge and power. I think a lot of my more recent work has focused on the importance of local knowledge and also the problems of how science and scientific knowledge contains a heavy dose of what I call false concreteness, and that people are disempowered, if you like, in terms of how official and scientific knowledge is handed down to them, which justifies, if you like, the kind of interventions and the way our lives are lived, the way places are designed, and the way decisions are made. So let's move quickly on. And I'm going to move very, very quickly, so I'm just giving 2 or 3 snapshots of several projects. Most of my work is kind of written work, but that manifests itself in kind of books, increasingly things like videos, a lot of research reports, I don't know, probably 100 or so to date, journal articles and book chapters. It's always interesting that work just gets picked up and translated, sometimes without them telling you, if it's the Chinese particularly. They did actually ask me if they could do that. But I think it's my point I made at the beginning is that once these things are out there, which things actually are most influential is something you have very little control over, and it's quite an odd thing. And I say that partly because my first big book is now sold out of print. The gestation, if you like, between when that starts to have impacts goes on for decades, because it's a global process. So somewhere in Singapore or China or Russia or Mongolia, suddenly picks it up and it's brand new to them. So at that point, it's completely new. I mean, I've kind of forgotten about it. I think it's old news. I don't really want to talk about it anymore. But to them, it's completely new. So there's that kind of temporal aspect to it. But quite often, the size and import of the output of research is in inverse proportion to the impact. So sometimes quite small studies can produce a particular output, and that actually can have a much bigger impact than the large. You've got my sense. I've got kind of design in my title, and I've got design in my job title, I suppose. So I'm going to use this interesting sort of upside-down quote from this Chinese Lao Tse. It sounds very Confucian, and that's because he was a contemporary of Confucius, but he wasn't the man. And I think this partly sums up my kind of approach to space and buildings and things and stuff. Because if you think about it, we started off with space, with nothing. We'll probably end up on the apocalypse with nothing. What we put in, the dwellings, the buildings, the structures, the stuff, the material things that we've made, of course, have been put into space. We tend to focus on the design of the thing, which is kind of what this is saying, by not appreciating sufficiently, or not even at all, quite often that architects talk about. I mean, Richard Rogers was a classic one that he saw the spaces in between his buildings as a backdrop to his buildings to offset the buildings he designed, rather than the fact that space comes first. Your building is just here today, gone tomorrow. It occupies a space, but the space is the main thing. The building actually is the secondary thing. Yeah, and that's quite a challenge to designers, because designers design things, whether it be a product design or not. And I was thinking, reading this, and I think if you think what Rachel Whiteread would do to the globe. So basically, she did one of her sort of concrete infill projects to the entire Earth and filled it all in. And what would be there? It would be the spaces in between, wouldn't it? You can see her famous house. She's actually making concrete tangible, the space, and that would actually give us a completely different perspective on her environment. So I'm going to whiz through very, very quickly. I'll probably skip some of them for brevity. This is a study I did a few years ago, 5-6 years, longish studies, multidisciplinary on mixed use. Mixed use became a kind of panacea for developers, designers, policymakers across both political divides from the late 1990s, because it seemed to be the solution to high density, compact cities, having more public transport, not needing a car so much, how we could squeeze more profitable usage out of a land footprint. I guess one model is the Parisian story here that's got a mixture of kind of retail, offices, perfumery, film, storage, residential on the top, and even accountants, for some reason, get the top floor. There you go. And that kind of model of that kind of mixed use, it seems to work very, very well in terms of both the structure, in terms of the usage, was something that was looked to. Of course, London is different. It's a different culture. The study we did took part of a large slice of Clerkenwell. Sorry, it's changing itself. Now these kind of model maps we see a lot now. This was done probably before Google Maps, and we started having software that could turn your kind of aerial view. I think I'm quite critical of a lot of the aerial view maps of cities, and other universities have special centres that just spend all their time doing this, because they are literally bird's eye views. They've got no really knowledge and understanding qualitatively of what's going on. What is the social? Who's inhabiting these spaces? What are they used for? How do they relate to each other? So this exercise, and it took us an inordinate amount of time, was to work out, sort of codify the different building and space uses, colour code them. We built this up from the kind of ground floor. And purple is kind of residential, so that one picks out more substantially in the north of the borough. So that's the kind of ground floor. As we build up, we start to see there's purple coming on top of non-purple. So this is people living above the shop kind of thing. And then as you go above first floor, kind of loft living. And it's kind of a fairly simple device that took a lot of effort to produce. It gave us some particular insights to the fact that you still need spatial separation between the residential and non-residential. Certain kinds of vertical use work, certain kinds don't. And we map this against a whole range of other data like crime data, economic, temporal. Because one of the issues of mixed use is, of course, spaces are increasingly used differently at different times of the day, which was something that designers and planners had never really had to countenance before. They give planning permission for a restaurant or an apartment block, with the assumption that it's 100% apartment block all of the time and 100% restaurant all of the time. Those things are no longer holding good. This is something that we had a couple of sessions I did, or several sessions I did with our interiors third-year students last year using this mixed-use case study on their project on the street, so it's quite timely. So the kind of street view seemed very important. So what we did elevations that kind of sliced off what was above the kind of human level, the street level. Because normally it would be the, obviously there's stuff above because that's actually at eye level, that's at human experience level where we interact with the building. Did it at daytime and nighttime. It's quite interesting to see how the experience changes. We looked at things like noise, environmental. We had acoustics engineers working with us. This is an area that had a lot of clubs, late night clubs. In fact, some of the first 24/7 clubs like Fabric, where you could go in at 6 p.m. and come out at 6 a.m. Then Smithfield Market opened, and you could get a drink at 6 a.m. because the market had special licensing rules. So literally, you could get a drink 24 hours a day if you wanted one. But most of the complaints were kind of music, but they were coming actually from other houses. So it was kind of myth that actually mixing these kind of what were seen to be antisocial activities together didn't hold good, and people were willing to trade off a whole range of kind of environmental disbenefits, if you like, for the benefits of the kind of high density of amenities, of having accessibility, having views. People are far willing to live in higher density places that didn't have gardens or even balconies if they know they could get out quite quickly. So it gave us quite a lot of insights, if you like, into how these mixed-use high density areas might operate. For the first time, we worked with commissioned artists. On the left, it's a still from a video that Helen Bendon, who works in our media, next door media school. Smithfield Market was part of Clerkenwell, so hence some of the references to the pink meat there, and a photographer called Jessica Thom. We amassed about 2,500 photographs across the research team, which we had access to. She did a forensic analysis of what was in the photographs. And the number one feature across all of those, I think, was fences, railings, and then pigeons. And she used that to inform her photographs. Helen did a kind of dramatic historical drama, having interviewed a lot of the residents. And it was the first time, I think, we'd actually formally used practicing artists for what was otherwise a mainstream research project that was really about the urban environment and sustainability. So I think that's an interesting lesson. Another project I'm going to speed up was around looking at urban design and accessibility. So on the transport side, we developed a street design audit. So again, working at a very forensic level, at the street level, something that isn't normally done because it takes too much time, or people really assume that it's so benign that you can't really improve on it, and it's not that important. What's important is when people reach their destination or get on the bus, or reach their workplace. The journey in between, if you like, is something that has been ignored. And from our research, we found out that the number one barrier to mobility, in fact, was fear of crime, safety, fast traffic, and it seems to be if you live in a poorer area, in a more deprived community, you're 4 times as likely to have a traffic accident than if you're in a better off area. So it's a startling statistic, and that's because in the better off area, most people and their kids are in the car. It's knocking down, the poor kid. I mean, I'm stereotyping, but you see, you get the drift. But of course, the more deprived areas also going to have, more people with physical disabilities, wheelchair bound, people pushing a couple of push chairs around and so on. So all those things conspire, if you like, to reduce, if you like, the accessibility of the environment. So we developed this over. So having fun, and I suppose a lot of the work I've flagged up started to develop visualizations of complexity. I mean, that's how I'd put it. This is actually Somerstown, which is now kind of behind Euston Station in King's Cross. Very roughish community, had bad reputation, Irish gangs versus Asian gangs, a lot of street theft. We found out, taking all the crime data, which is another design culture I've come across, which is crime prevention officers or architectural liaison officers, they used to be called. They dropped that name now because they can't really claim to have any at all design training. But they were experienced cops. They tended to be latter in their careers. So we got hold of crime data, interviewed them, and we found that most of the crime that happened in this crime-ridden neighbourhood was actually during the commuter hours, and it was pickpockets who didn't live in the area who were fleecing the people coming by. But that got associated with that neighbourhood. That neighbourhood was a dangerous area, but it wasn't the neighbour itself that was generating the crime. We do map walks. taking people out. So again, I guess a lot of the work is, I mean, there's a lot of investment now in what we call urban laboratories, virtual reality labs and so on, trying to simulate the real world. But it seems to me that we should be doing much more getting out into the real world, because this is the reality in terms of how people experience their spaces. And it's quite a simple technique, if you like, to do these map walks. And what you tend to find is that different communities, or single parents, this is under 27-year-old, actually mainly Asian men, have quite different perspectives. So their space is socially produced. It's produced through their perceptions and on what they see is problematic or not. We compare the design guidance, what the official design expertise tells us, compare that with what the users say, and we see convergence and divergence. So the big conclusion there was that local knowledge actually overrides a lot of the kind of design considerations. I'm going to flick through this one because it's a work with CAVE, the Commission for Architecture and Built Environment, that's now been effectively wound up and moved into the Design Council, developed something called a design quality indicator. And one of the case studies we did was on the Tate. I'm just going to put this up because this is another example of where different user perspectives of the same space diverges significantly, whether you're a user, whether you're the architect, whether you're the project manager. So these kind of spider diagrams take the same factors for these different user perspectives. So it was an interesting tool in terms of how you might factor different design qualities. But I guess one important research finding for me particularly is that difference of perception. So how you actually design and respond to that is a big challenge, isn't it? And whether the visitor user should be at the top of the hierarchy and whether the professional should be lower down is another decision. Different types. I think I'm probably going to skip this. This is another example of the smallest piece of work commissioned by the Culture Ministry back in about 10 years ago. The government were concerned that a huge amount of money, remember when the National Lottery came in, those that you can remember that, hundreds of millions are going into cultural, sport and heritage facilities. Lots of claims were being made about their impact. They were a major contributor to regeneration of all sorts, but they were quite frightened that there was a lack of an evidence base, I suppose. So we did a couple of years study for them looking at the hard evidence and actually how you might measure and how you might model the impact of cultural investment and cultural contribution to this so-called regeneration project. The problem is, of course, that a lot of high-profile projects failed. The public, the Urbis Centre, the ill-fated Sheffield Pop Museum. But I think this is also an issue for the intermediaries, because the idea that you can museumify pop culture is clearly wrong. And it doesn't surprise me at all, being really part of music culture. Some things just don't transfer very well into that museum, even if the building itself is designed in this very wacky way. This is the Museum of the City. Museum of the City? I mean, so the concept and theme is problematic. So I think a lot of these failed, if you like, partly because of the failure to understand how things transfer into a kind of building, into a kind of museum, gallery type of environment. And these are some of the kind of impacts that we focus. It's interesting, the government were interested in the environmental impact, the economic impact, of course, the social impact. They hadn't really thought about cultural impact. So here we were talking about culture, but they were less interested, most of the models that were being used up until then, they weren't really considering culture as being an impact of cultural investment. So in fact, the obvious seemed to be missing there. This is the archetypal cultural regeneration project is the Bilbao Guggenheim Museum, that most of you know, Go designed. Its collections leased from the Guggenheim Foundation at vast expense. I think the license that the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao goes on for another 5 years, I think. They reckon the payback from what they paid the Guggenheim Foundation, probably by 2018, will have paid back the investment the city has made. So in one sense, it's been a success as a visitor attraction. It's mainly tourists that go there. Very, very little Basque art has ever featured in this museum. This is Chillida, who's kind of the Basque Henry Moore, if you can make that claim. Certainly beautiful stuff. He's got his own foundation in the public park, or the late Chillida. Basically, their funding's dried up. Obviously, arts funding cuts in Spain have been quite acute. So it's interesting that the kind of selectivity and choice about what culture is supported, what is valued. I'm juxtaposing those for obvious reasons. Basque culture, if you like, does not seem to be worthy enough to continue supporting, whereas something which is obviously an imported model is. So these are some of the, these are some of the more problematic questions around culture and regeneration. How far the vernacular is, this is on the left, this is Ordos city, which is in Mongolia. Anybody been there? It's now mainly Chinese dominated, but it was a Mongolian province, Mongolian riders there. But these are examples, if you like, of that westernized model, which people like Zaha Hadid are probably best known for. And this is quite problematic when you see what's going on in the Middle East and many other countries, taking that sort of cultural facility around the form with less focus on the function. Hadid's Rome gallery has not really worked, it's closed. The Zitteroy, Oscar Niemeyer's, the late Oscar Niemeyer's building we went through years and years ago, and of course it suffers like a lot. It's been not really particularly well designed for the nice rectangular picture. I'm going to wave that here. And if you go back to the original Guggenheim, well, it was based on a design taken from a multi-storey car park, which is, when you look at it, it makes complete sense. So the idea that you've got a ramp, so you're already working on a ramp, everything is curved, well, it wouldn't really be the best design, if you like, for hanging works of art, but you still seem to be doing that. We're going to flick through the cultural planning toolkit. So examples of how the work has got out there. I suppose a lot of it has found its way through things like toolkits, online toolkits, particularly around where cities or local authorities are trying to extend. We've had a kind of housing growth movement in the UK, and that continues despite the recession. One of the questions was, if we were building another Milton Keynes today, remember the concrete cows there, how would we plan culture? Because that question was never asked when we built the first new towns, when we built our first cities. We've always been the poor cousin, if you like, of both city planning and the kind of amenities that get built. We need hospitals, we need schools. Culture, what is it? Do we need one museum? Do we need 3 art centres? There's never been any reference or guide or any way, if you like, to feed them into that kind of planning system. So this Living Places project produced a kind of cultural planning toolkit that gave planners and developers, if you like, a blueprint and a way to visualise that. So we carried out pilot studies in places like Woolwich, so these sort of nondescript places where you don't think these are particularly cultural capitals. But we've always found, having done these studies for over 20 years, that most culture takes place not in formal cultural spaces. It's happening unseen in churches, in faith centres, in youth clubs, in community centres, within schools, in parks. Most people working in the culture and creative industries work from home, probably about 30 to 40%. So the kind of official map, if you like, of culture of a place, the official one, is hugely unrepresentative. So a lot of the work we've worked on over the years has actually been, well, how do you actually find out what people need and what people are doing in a pretty exhaustive way. One of the ways we do that is through this kind of participatory, what's now, to use the parlance, co-design. It's obviously working with particular groups at all ages, whether it's young kids or pensioners in this case, whether it's the open air, whether it's exhibitions. And this is just this particular technique in action. This is Sutton House, which is a National Trust property, one of their lesser known. This is when the National Trust, I think, were embarrassed that they didn't have any urban properties, because they're associated with countryside and stately homes. So this is one of their first moves, if you like, to develop this facility in the city. And we use this GIS participation technique with under fives, 3 generations. There were Turkish families, for instance, that had never been in the building before, that lived around the corner. And this is just the method, if you like, to capture their usage, their perceptions. They found it quite too dark. The Turkish elders quite liked the fact that there were cooking pots hanging over the fireplace, because that's how they cooked at home. So for the first time, there was this kind of connection between life in London and the life they'd left behind in Turkey. Like I mentioned, I've been working in Maastricht for the last 3 years on the back of their bid for European Capital of Culture. The interesting thing, very different from multicultural and multilingual London, is that it's linguistically divided, trans-border region, with Belgium 5 minutes away, Germany 10 minutes away, disconnected from the rest of the Netherlands in the kind of Catholic south, no big cities, So you had this a lot of tensions around language, around history, particularly history of the war, included within that. So one of our approaches was to use a kind of non-linguistic landscape approach to linking up these fragmented parts of this region that Maastricht was the major city, working with some landscape designers, engineering based in Rotterdam. And we picked up the railways are quite important. Like in this country, we've lost a lot of our railway infrastructure. So we went back and looked at some of these old closed stations and how they look today. Some you can kind of still see the lie of the land. Some it's been changed quite a lot through landscaping. And that featured as part of the European Capital of Culture bid as a way both to link those fragmented communities and then through with the landscape designers to develop some particular cycle and walking trails across them. I'm going to flick my festival world. I helped set up in 2004, which is now 10 years ago, the London Architecture Festival. It was a biennale then. We greened over St John Street down from Clerkenwell, took over several buildings, had kind of open architectural studios. And it was the first time, if you like, my point about putting things like design and architecture and popular culture in museums is quite challenging. It's seldom successful. Actually celebrating this outdoors seem much more successful. It's now an annual event. The London Festival of Architecture happens each June and July. Right, I'm just going to go through maps. This is just more examples of clusters, working with Digital Shoreditch in East London. Going back to my bubble, remember, about cultural production and innovation, how it happens. One of the phenomenon that a lot of creative industries like to cluster together, clustering areas that are either messy, sometimes quite expensive in terms of property, not very accessible, don't have the kind of range of amenities. The kind of new media and digital industries, in one sense, could be anywhere, yes, in the nature of their work. So why do they still like to cluster together? So that was a classic research question. I guess what I'd found, having researched the area back from the 1970s and 80s, and this is another feature of work, a lot of my work has revisited the same spaces and places every 10 or 15 years, which is perhaps unusual. What it does give you is insights in terms of what your perceptions and understandings were then, how they've actually stood the test of time, how you can see and measure change. And this area had been, for 300-400 years, had been symbolically and practically a heart of the craft industries, printing, publishing, cultural industries moved in after that, in the 1970s and 80s, and then the new digital industries moved in after that. So a lot of the official rhetoric, and the government have branded this area tech city, some of you might have heard that, is that suddenly this just landed like a spaceship, like Silicon Valley out of nowhere. Was in fact, it was a continuation of arts, crafts, cultural, creative, and now kind of digital industries. So there seemed to be this phenomenon, which I've studied and mapped in other cities, seems to have a combination. There's this kind of symbolic cultural significance, which is not just about people, places, and money. There's a kind of physical significance in terms of the types of spaces and buildings and history. There's something that the symbolic history imbues in these areas that still attracts the new, but sometimes it displaces the old. They're not, they can be in competition. They can squeeze out the old cultural industries, can be overridden by some of the new creative industries and the new digital industries. And that's happening now as big companies like Google, with the government's open invitation to move in, will squeeze out some of the small firms. So we do have this kind of creative destruction, as Schumpeter had it going on, but there's a deep symbolic as well as a kind of physical, environmental importance to some of these spaces where cultural and creative clusters. And one of the main new finding that came out of this work is that for the first time, this creative digital phenomenon was happening. Before, we had people who worked in computers, that did coding, that looked after the hardware and ICT. They were the least creative and cultural and arts type people one could possibly almost think of. Then you had the creatives. For the first time, they converged. So we had hardware coding programmers, people that done computer science and maths at college, working with video games people, graphic artists and designers. And it happened kind of organically. It happened partly because of the clustering effect. And a lot of the computer firms were based on the back of the financial services in the City of London, so they were there and a couple of miles away. So that proximity did matter. So again, we had no idea what the finding was going to be. It was more of a grounded theory approach, looking at the phenomenon of this particular cluster and we find this particular result coming out. The last two projects I'm finishing up now have moved back into the more environmental sphere, which is perhaps relevant in terms of the imperatives around climate change. I finished last year a 4-year study, European-funded study on coastal cities and climate change. Again, working with climatologists and environmental scientists, yet another cultural group that are in, on one sense, another planet, working with huge 100-year rainfall data sets and massive modelling of climates and so on. And then kind of social scientists and humanities people trying to make sense on the ground with communities of what's actually happening to them. And again, where their local knowledge feeds into this kind of scientific model, which it turns out can be quite flawed in terms of forecasting. And I think the recent floods in this country have flagged that up. But when people are told that there's a 1 in 100 years chance of their area flooding, assume that's fine. I'm going to be dead in 100 years. But what they're not told is it's just as likely to flood in year 1 as it is in year 99. So it's a kind of misuse or a use of statistics which isn't really helpful to the layperson that doesn't really appreciate that they bought this property and they think 100 years is a risk I'm worth taking. As we found out over the last 6 months, year 1 just happened if you just moved into that area. And we've been building on these floodplains and in areas which have been reclaimed in this country and obviously in developing countries even more so. We take places like Mumbai and so on. So a lot of the kind of human impacts, disastrous as they are actually primarily human-driven in terms of we've started to inhabit places, build in ways, modern architecture rather than more resilient architecture in cities like Bangkok. I mean, Bangkok has been flooding for 100 years, so the flood impacts that have been happening are not to do with the weather change in the short term. They're actually to do with human settlement and inappropriate design of spaces. And we worked with a climatologist on this project, and this is a kind of cumulonimbus, I think, roughly storm cloud. And he gave me this kind of model of how it would be looked if you had a really, really powerful computer that nobody has, very high resolution model of that cloud in Lego there. If it was a kind of low resolution, that would be the Duplo version. If it was the kind of satellite image or what most weather forecasters use, it would be this children's going to put. In other words, it wouldn't show up. It wouldn't show up at all. So I think that was quite telling. So the new project, like I mentioned, is the AHRC project called Hydro Citizenships, which is revisiting this kind of water, but using a range of arts and humanities methods and approaches to work with communities, in our case, in and around the Lee Valley, which includes in the south of it the Olympic Park, hence the reference to the Olympic. Final slide, gathering information. I mean, graffiti isn't something I've ever been particularly interested in. It's got a benign backdrop, isn't it? It's a kind of nuisance. Is it semi-vandalism? Is it art? One's always been aware, I suppose, that it's been street art is something that came into the galleries in New York, I mean, as long ago as the 1980s. Or Basquiat was probably the best known. More recently, Banksy, of course, they've become commodified and high values put on some of their stolen work. But they didn't really work. That transfer into the gallery, of course, took away the basic meaning of what true graffiti is. A few years ago, I was in New York and interviewed the crew that did all the subway train graffiti. They're now in their kind of mid-30s. A lot of them have gone to jail because the prison sentences have gone up quite significantly in the UK and in the States for anyone caught, so it's a high risk. So they've now gone legit. They work mainly for advertising agencies, big department stores, and the city authority commission. So we now have graffiti commissioning agencies. There's several in London, for instance. So I'm looking particularly about that turning around, that graffiti is now seen to be a kind of a place-making strategy as something, rather than something which is to do with vandalism and resistance. And this is just a few examples. That's New York, done by that crew. Shoreditch, Olympic site. Yeah, this is in Amsterdam where I was recently, this fantastic Three Chickens. But in fact, it's a kind of legitimised bit of graffiti at the bottom of the former Royal Dutch Shell building that's now being vacated because it's no longer health and safety. And post 9/11, Shell are a bit nervous about having a tower for some reason. And it's now been taken over by an events and dance company, and the place is being regenerated. And Suzanne will recognise her favourite building, which is the Eye Film Institute. So that's my hydro citizenship and the graffiti projects, probably the ones that are going to take me through to the next 2 or 3 years. And this is Banksy before, this is up Wood Green, it's not far from where I live. And this is, of course, as it was cut out, and afterwards I referenced it to the when the Mona Lisa was stolen, and thousands of Parisians came out to the Louvre to look at the space where the Mona Lisa no longer was. So there's probably a novel in that, but I think it's already written. And this is my final quote, really, by Hermann Hertzberger's seminal book, I think, on lessons for students in architecture. That where the pressure to plan and design spaces, to designate them, rather than leaving spaces partly vacant and flexible, where people can actually adapt them and use them and design them themselves, is something that the official city planning and design system isn't really willing to give up that control and power over. But what Hertzberger, I think, is saying is, for spaces to be successful, for people to inhabit them meaningfully rather than a controlled or unsatisfactory sense, we need that ability to populate and use the spaces for our own. Okay, this is final slide. This is, Anne will recognise, this is the Tate Tate exhibition of the first launch of her book in the original Dover Street building, where they put a series of dates up and down the stairs. Those are my feet. This is me leaving. The end, or new beginning. Thank you.